Welcome to the 50th episode of the Head Kick KO podcast. Today we are doing a breakdown of UFC 269. That was a tremendous card. There's going to be a lot to talk about, so we're going to get right to it. Obviously, we are going to start at the main event, which was headlined by Dustin Poirier and Charles Oliveira. Now, the first round was a tremendous round for Dustin Poirier. He landed 56 headshots in that first round, and he was setting himself up very nicely. He had a knockdown. He really was dominating that first round, and watching that first round, you really got the feeling that Charles really couldn't do much to Dustin. And I think there was one, I don't want to call it a takedown attempt, but there was one time where, I guess it was a full takedown attempt, where Oliveira got him in the clinch, and Dustin did not get taken down, so that was his best round grappling as well. However, in that round, Charles Oliveira once again showed no quits. He got knocked down, he came back, and throughout this round, where Dustin Poirier was landing so many solid strikes, Charles Oliveira still put in a lot of work. He was throwing some front kicks to the body. He was throwing some elbows. He was throwing some knees to the body, and he had some really nice shots that landed that I think could have played a role if this fight went longer than 3 rounds, and it could have played a role in the fight itself. Because he was laying the groundwork with some really nice body shots and investing in those in case that fight went deep into the 4th and 5th round, which for Charles is a tremendous strategy for when you're on the feet. And then in the second round, Oliveira gets a takedown, and a lot of people were upset over a glove grab by Oliveira. I didn't see it. I think there might have been a slight hook initially, not enough to really cause anything. But then I think after that it went to wrist control. I think the majority of the time where they were in the position where people have the alleged glove grab, I think 99% of that control is wrist control and not finger in the glove. So I'm not really too worried about that right now. And then from right after that sequence where there was the glove grab, alleged. Well, I guess I shouldn't say alleged because there was an initial glove grab and then a transition into wrist control. He had the glove for less than a second. But regardless, he used that wrist control to transition and got on top. And once he got on top, Dustin Poirier really wasn't going to go anywhere. And I think that's obviously strategy. I'm not going to say he couldn't get up, but he didn't want to take the risks required to get up. He didn't want to open that guard and give Charles Oliveira the opportunity to pass into some advantageous positions. So he let Charles win that round. And if you're Dustin, that's not a bad thing to do once. You can let Charles win a round, especially when you bag the first one so fully. And that means you pretty much have 3 more rounds. You got to win 2 of the last 3. And for Dustin, I imagine he was thinking he could go out there and win. He could go out there and win rounds 4 or 5. So I don't think it was a terrible strategy. And then the 3rd round kicks off, and it started to play out very similarly to that 3rd round. And in the sense where Charles had found some success early grappling. And Charles was able to transition to the back. He got on the back standing, and he was able to finish the fight. Absolutely tremendous finish for Charles Oliveira, and adds another great finish to his resume with finishes over a 3rd round finish over Dustin Poirier, a 2nd round knockout over Michael Chandler, a 3rd round submission of Kevin Lee. And that's just out of his last 4 fights. And the only other fight in that sequence where he didn't find a finish was Tony Ferguson, who is one of the hardest fighters to finish. So Charles is really, really cementing his legacy as a very strong champion right now, and he did that in this fight because a lot of people didn't necessarily like the Oliveira and Chandler title fight. A lot of people wanted Poirier in that, and a lot of people believed Poirier was the best lightweight in the world. Um, and Oliveira proved to those people that he is the best lightweight in the world at the moment. So I think that really cemented his legacy and kind of is demanding respect. Not to say people didn't respect him, but he was underestimated a little going into this fight, I feel like. And what is next for Charles Oliveira? It's pretty simple. He's obviously going to fight Justin Gaethje. This has been one of the few fights where Dana White, after the fact, has said, he came out and said, yeah, Gaethje makes sense. So that fight is, barring an injury, barring, someone demanding an absurd amount of money, there's a very few hurdles left prior to making this Gaethje and Oliveira championship fight. However, the bigger question is what is next for Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier is in an interesting position, being, in my mind, he really has three routes, right? There are three routes Dustin Poirier could take. And before I go a little bit more in depth on each route, I have I'll tell you the three routes first. So, two very similar where he is pursuing a championship belt. Sounds strange, but you'll get what I'm saying here. First is him pursuing the belt at 155. The second is him pursuing the belt at 170, and the third is him doing money fights for right now. And I broke it down into those three categories because after the fight, Dustin Poirier, in his post-fight press conference, said, I think I can get back to a championship fight. And the question is going to be, do I want that? Do I want to put in the work to be a UFC champion? And he said that's a question he has to ask himself. And if the answer is yes, he does, he would fall under that 155 championship chase category. At the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if he moves to 170 pounds. He is a big guy, right? By no means would he be the biggest in that division, but I think he would be bigger than some of those guys. I think he's bigger than Colby Covington, possibly. Gilbert Burns is a big, strong guy, but he doesn't have the height. There's other guys who would be way taller than him, like a Wonder Boy. Usman is going to be much, much more muscular than him, so he by no means would he be the biggest. But, however, he is a big guy at 155, and he has expressed issues with the weight cut. This weight cut went pretty well, but the whole Conor thing, there was a lot of talk at the first fight happening at 170 pounds. And, people have kind of forgotten about that. And I've always been interested in seeing Poirier move to 170 just because I feel like it gives him some fresh competition. He's already fought a lot of the top guys at 155 pounds. For example, he just fought Charles. He's already fought Gaethje. And those guys are going to be looking at a championship soon. So, I wouldn't be surprised. I think he can get a fast track to a title shot if he goes to 170 pounds. I think if he gets one win in the top 5, top 6 at 170, I think they put him against Usman next. And I think that is something, if you're Poirier and you want that belt, I really think that is something that you have to consider. So, and then obviously the last category was the money fights. If he decides, I'm not really here for that championship chase right now, he could take a route similar to what Jorge expressed and what he wanted to do, where he takes the Diaz fight, where, it looks like he's going to pursue a Colby Covington fight, where there's a lot of different options for him and some big names who I assume would be interested in fighting him. So we're going to talk about those last. But first, the first category we will discuss, which is probably the most likely, in my opinion, is the title chase at 155 pounds. Now, this 155-pound top 5 is pretty well booked from here on out. Looking at that, we can assume that we are going to see Charles Oliveira versus Justin Gaethje next, and I assume that fight isn't going to happen until late spring, maybe early summer of next year. A lot of guys, especially a lot of these guys who fought in the December cards, I imagine they're going to pack it up until after, the holidays, and they'll get back in the gym shortly after the new year. So I imagine that's something that they're looking, maybe March at the absolute earliest. I wouldn't be surprised, like I said, April, May, June, even July, I think would be a little bit further out than expected. But you never know, depending on how the pay-per-view landscape works out. I think they will be a main event, right? There'll be a main event of a pay-per-view, barring the UFC wanting to absolutely stack a card. They will be the main event, and you've got other guys out there who need to get booked. You've got Usman. They're doing the heavyweight in January. That's already booked. They've got to book that bantamweight. Maybe they put the bantamweight and the lightweight on the same card. That would be a good back-to-back. Regardless, we're kind of getting off track here, back on track. And then the top-ranked guys in that division would be Justin Gaethje, who's fighting for the belt. And then you have Beneil Dariush and Islam Makhachev at 3 and 4, who are booked to fight one another in February. So, maybe the winner of that fight is going to get the title shot after Oliveira and Gaethje, I'm assuming. So I don't necessarily think that really makes any sense. So I think, for me, I'm looking at Michael Chandler sitting at 5, and that makes sense as he is the highest-ranked guy who is not booked. It makes sense in the fact that, in theory, that would be a fight of the year contender, right? That would be a 5-round war, a 3-round war, however the UFC wants to do it. I think Poirier has gotten to the point where he's a 5-round guy, even if he's not the main event. I think he enters that category, and I think there's a select few. I think it's Poirier, Masvidal, the Diaz brothers. But I think Poirier, I wouldn't be surprised if he's, the co-main of a pay-per-view, and he is fighting 5 rounds. Or maybe he's the third fight down and he's got 2 title fights above him. Regardless, I think Chandler versus Dustin makes a lot of sense. Looking at the current landscape of the division. And also you've got an outside shot at RDA, which I'm not really sure that would happen, but I don't want to push that out of. I don't want to say that couldn't happen. And then we'll talk more about the other lightweights, which I'm sure you are surprised I haven't said their name yet, because Conor is obviously going to fall in the money section rather than the chase to the belt section, which Conor and that kind of intertwines there. That those could play together. But I'll talk later when we get to the money section about why Conor's in that section. Anyways, I think if he moves to 170, there's a lot more options, a lot more fun options, a lot less restrictions for him up there in terms of matchmaking, because it's fresh faces. I don't think he's fought any of these guys. I know some of these guys have had spent time at 155, like Gilbert Burns, but I'm pretty sure Burns and Poirier never fought. So even the guys who fought at even like Kayla, even the guys who fought at 155, I don't think they ever matched up with Dustin Poirier. And if you look at Poirier moving up to that 170-pound division, right off the top, you've got Colby Covington, number 1, who Colby and Dustin have been former training partners who no longer get along. I imagine they do Colby versus Jorge, but if there's a fight that could break that up, Poirier could come in and steal that Colby fight, and then you could work right back to Leanne versus Jorge if you want to give Leanne a fight before a title shot. I think you could do Usman versus Leanne right now, and it would make sense. But if you want to do a fight before Usman gets a title shot, in that scenario, you preserve Leanne versus Jorge. And then even number 2, Gilbert Burns versus Poirier, I don't think that would be the direction that they go. But I think that would be an incredibly fun fight, just based off how well-rounded both of those guys are. Looking at number 3, Leon Edwards versus Dustin Poirier, that would almost be a certain title, or almost certain to be a title eliminator there. Another tremendous fight. Looking at 4, Vicente Luque versus Dustin Poirier, that would once again it'd be another title eliminator for both guys. Looking at number 5, even Wonderboy. Wonderboy fights next weekend against Bilal Muhammad. But if he gets a win, Dustin Poirier versus Wonderboy, kind of, it doesn't make sense in a way, but it's such a strange matchup and a strange fight where Dustin Poirier is such an orthodox boxer, right? Who mixes in some leg kicks and does some other things very, very well. Against a pure, I don't want to say pure karate guy, but someone who will stay on the outside and throw the 1s and the 2s and the flashy kicks. I think it would be a very interesting matchup. And then you have Jorge Masvidal at 6. Jorge and Poirier will not fight because they're teammates. Excuse me. But regardless, anyone in that top 5, I think, really perks my ears up and gets Dustin Poirier 1 fight away from a title shot. I'm not sure that you can say the same thing at 155 pounds. I don't think there's a scenario, even if he goes and he knocks Chandler out, I think he's got to take 1 more before he gets back to the belt. So I think this would be a fast track. He would be able to not cut as much weight. I think he would probably plan to add on some muscle. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. And looking at Colby, once again, Colby's the number 1 ranked guy. There's beef there. Colby isn't an incredibly large welterweight. He's probably smaller than all the other guys listed. So a Colby versus Poirier match would make sense because it's kind of an entry. And you can understand if you can deal with someone a little bit bigger than you usually see. So I really like that fight. And I think that fight would be really, really fun, and it'd be a fun one to see. And then the third section we laid out was the money fights. And I had 3 names in the money fights. 2 of them are like, oh yeah, that's a money fight. And the third one, you're like, huh? First one, obviously, is Conor. The Conor and Poirier 4th fight will always be there, right? And that's why I think it doesn't necessarily need to happen right away. Especially when you look at when does Dustin Poirier want to get in there again. If Dustin says, I don't want to fight till July or August, maybe that fight makes a little bit more sense, If he wants to wait until sometime during the summer and kind of will be ready by that point, then that fight makes more sense. If he wants to get back in a little bit sooner, then you got to start looking at some of the previously listed options. And the other option there, Nate Diaz, who was always a money fight, but and they had history, That fight could take place at 170. They had a long history of that fight was supposed to happen. That fight was booked, and it just fell through. Poirier had to get surgery, so it didn't work out. But there's been some trash talk over the years where Diaz said he won that fight because Poirier didn't make the walk. There was another thing that kind of happened there. I don't remember the full history, but they were supposed to fight, and the UFC ran the Khabib and Conor trailer during their press conference, and that really frustrated Nate. So that fight kind of fell through a little bit more. And the last big fight is Tony Ferguson. I always think Tony Ferguson fights will interest people, and I don't necessarily I don't necessarily think it's a money fight as much as it is a big name fight, where the name Tony Ferguson will always spur interest. So that's why I threw it in this category. And even if you look at the rankings, I know the rankings don't mean everything, but even Tony is ranked ahead of Conor right now at 155 pounds. So I wouldn't be overly surprised if that happens. Well, in comparison to some of these other options, but this is a situation where we're going to have to watch this closely, right? We're going to, because there's a lot of directions this can go, and I think all of them are very interesting. No matter what Dustin Poirier does in his next fight, it's going to be interesting. And moving on from that, the next fight we are going to speak about is Amanda Nunez and Julianna Pena. This was another tremendous fight. The first round, it felt like Nunez was dominating, right? And she had some good top control. But there were some moments on the feet where Julianna was landing, and I'm like, oh, well, that's Amanda Nunez. We're all good. That's all good. That's Amanda Nunez, You just didn't feel like it could happen. And Amanda walked out of there with a 10-9 in round one. You moved to round two, Pena started landing more. She started landing more, and you kind of get the sense of, like, you can see Amanda, who's starting to show some signs of, being hurt. She started to show some signs of being tired, which are things that we haven't seen in a significant period of time from Amanda Nunez. And then it eventually gets to the ground. Pena locks in a rear naked choke, which wasn't even that deep in all honesty, and Julianna Pena ends up winning second round submission over the greatest women's mixed martial artist of all time by a long mile. And now I think it is safe to say that was the biggest upset in UFC history. I don't think there's an if. I don't think there's a maybe. I think that is definitively the biggest upset of all time. When you look at how invincible Amanda Nunez has looked for such a long period of time, and she frankly just looked invincible and ahead by miles of everyone else, to where she loses and just didn't see it coming. Not this time, didn't see it coming. However, I do think that Amanda didn't really look like herself. And I'm not trying to discredit Julianna Pena, but that's an observation that I had personally. We're watching this fight. Amanda has been in there with better strikers. She's been in there with the cyborgs of the world, and she's been in there with Durandamy. And when she got into a brawl with Chris Cyborg was knocked out shortly after, right? There's not many fighters that can get into a brawl with Amanda Nunez, and Julianna Pena got in a brawl with Amanda Nunez and walked out on top, which is, if you were to tell me that there was a path to Julianna Pena winning this fight, I wouldn't have expected it to be her getting into a brawl, winning those exchanges, and then forcing the wrestling to come out. It's not what I was expecting at all, and it is very surprising. And, we'll get some clarification. There will be a rematch, and if Julianna Pena does it again, then that takes all the questions out. If Amanda, however, wins, then it'll kind of show, like, this might have been a fluke. And that's the best thing about MMA, is we will have that fight, we will see that fight, and there won't be a question afterwards. Right now, there are some questions, how it's just, how did that happen? And we will get those answers. And regardless of the legacies at stake here, somehow Kayla Harrison walked out as the biggest loser. They had her in the front row. They've been negotiating with Kayla Harrison. There has been nothing, and ever since she became a free agent, the UFC doesn't really talk much about fighters in other organizations, right? Especially when they're under contract. When they're not in contract, when they become a free agent, it becomes a slightly different story. Kind of test the waters, right? It happened with Michael Chandler, where you kind of test the waters and you throw the name out there. Dana can throw the name out there a little bit and see if it sticks. With Kayla Harrison, it stuck obviously because that Amanda Nunez and Kayla Harrison fight has had traction for over a year now, probably maybe a little bit less than a year, but there's always been traction there. And that fight was, if Amanda Nunez won that fight and the UFC signed Kayla Harrison, the next fight for Amanda Nunez would have been Amanda Nunez versus Kayla Harrison at 145 pounds. At this point, that's not going to happen. We're going to get the immediate rematch, and if Nunez wins that fight, we might have to see a trilogy. So, for Kayla Harrison, her big fight, her career-defining fight, just got pushed back maybe a year. So for Kayla Harrison, this was absolutely terrible for her. And you got to feel for her because she's a great fighter. And it just doesn't look like she's going to get that opportunity that she once had. That opportunity was right in front of her, and it got taken away, which you have to feel bad. But I guess that's the sport. The sport changes very, very quickly. Moving on, Santiago Ponzinibio versus Jeff Neal. I don't have a breakdown of this one really. I don't want to say this was forgettable because it was a good fight, but watching this fight take place in between Sean O'Malley, Kai France, this fight, Amanda Nunez, Julianna Pena, Dustin Poirier, Charles Oliveira. It just it was an unfortunate placement on the card. They were not supposed to fight in that spot. That was supposed to be Leanne versus Jorge Masvidal. So they were kind of sunk in to a position where it was madness, Jeff Neal, Santiago Ponzinibio, madness. But you can't really blame each guy because each guy went out there to win and not get into a war, which is the smarter thing to do. So credit to them for that. But at the end of the day, Jeff Neal added a tremendous win onto his resume. Santiago Ponzinibio is a very skilled fighter, and he looks very good on a resume. Jeff Neal got a big opportunity against Wonder Boy, and unfortunately he lost that fight, but he's really working himself back up these rankings very efficiently, and he's fighting whoever the UFC offers him at this point. And I'm interested to see where he goes moving forward. I wouldn't be surprised if we see him versus Belal Muhammad. If Belal Muhammad loses on Saturday, I think if Belal wins, he's obviously going to fight higher up in the rankings. And if Wonder Boy, that would mean Wonder Boy would lose, and I don't see that rematch happening. So I think for Jeff Neal, he should probably be rooting for Wonder Boy on Saturday. That kind of gives him some more options moving forward. But outside of that, I think Michael Chiesa also makes a level of sense, where they're very close in the rankings. Chiesa's coming off a loss. Jeff Neal's working his way up. I think it makes sense. For Santiago Ponzinibio, I think he isn't going to get a ranked opponent next, but I think he's going to take on someone who is very skilled and someone who is just outside those rankings. A similar position as Miguel Baeza, where Baeza was a top prospect who just wasn't ranked yet. And I think we see that again. And I think in this form, it goes Daniel Rodriguez would be an interesting name. And Daniel Rodriguez might not be the best description of a prospect, but Daniel Rodriguez is a very talented guy who isn't in that top 15. And I think that is ultimately what we're looking for. And the other name is going to be Shavkat Rakhmonov. He has looked tremendous so far in his UFC career, and he is probably now the best prospect outside of the rankings in that division. Khamzat Chimaev, obviously tremendous prospect. Miguel Baeza, another tremendous prospect. But since Baeza's coming off a loss, I think that Shavkat kind of jumps him in the Head Kick KO podcast prospect rankings, or AKA in my mind. So I think that would be a really fun fight for Ponzinibio versus Shavkat, and then we can kind of get some more Some more new names in that 170-pound division. Some of these divisions need some fresh faces. I think 170 is one of them. So I think breaking either of those guys into the top 10. In this case, they would be getting into the top 15, but they would be working their way towards the top 10. Now, another absolutely tremendous fight, Cody Garbrandt versus Kai Kara-France. Kai Kara-France came in with the absolute best game plan you can for this fight. He hit Cody. He was able to connect, which is the hardest part about fighting Cody. Fighting Cody, once you connect, it gets a lot easier. Once you can land a good shot, the fight gets a lot easier for you. Up until that point, if you don't land that big shot, it's going to be a lot tougher because you don't want to let Cody Garbrandt start flowing. It's like Cody Garbrandt versus Dominic Cruz, where Cody Garbrandt really started flowing in that fight. You don't want to let Cody get to that point. You don't want to give Cody the opportunities to land shots like Rafaela Santao did. Kai Kara-France came in and landed a big shot early and continuously pressured him while he was hurt. He never let him off the hook. And a lot of people are talking about the chin of Cody Garbrandt. I'm not really concerned about the chin based off what we saw. We saw him get knocked once, get back up, and then he got hit with a lot of big shots. It wasn't one that put him out flush. It was he got hit several times by several big shots. And Kai Kara-France slowly but surely put him away. So respect to Kai Kara-France for a career-defining victory and a tremendous performance, and he did so with a great game plan. Now the question for Kai Kara-France is, did he do enough to get that title shot? In January, we're going to be looking for another title contender, right? Possibly. Because that fight's an interesting one. The Moreno-Figueiredo trilogy, what do we do? What do we do if Davies and Figueiredo won? Where we'd be sitting in a position where you've got Figueiredo, who lost by draw in that, I don't want to say lost by draw, but Figueiredo, the first fight was a draw, but Figueiredo lost a point. So he was really up on the judges' scorecards and lost a point, so it became a draw. And then Moreno dominates the second one. And if Moreno goes out there once again and dominates, which I think Moreno wins, but if Davies and Figueiredo wins, we're looking at draw, and then you're split 1-1. Do you do the fourth fight, right? I don't know. I do not know. But it's an interesting question to be had. And another interesting question is, does a win over Cody Garbrandt, someone making his debut in the division, in terms of title contention, does it jump you over Askar Askarov? The two biggest names right now, not the two biggest names, the two, closest to that title shot are Askar Askarov and Alexandre Pantoja. But Askar Askarov does have the leg up because I'm pretty sure he has a win over Pantoja. Did Kai Kara-France do enough to jump all the way above Askar Askarov? When Askar Askarov is, I don't know the record off the top of my head, but Askar Askarov is a tremendous fighter, and I will pull up his record. Askar Askarov is 14-0-1, with his one being a tie, a draw with Brandon Moreno. On the other hand, Kai Kara-France already has a loss to Brandon Moreno. So, does that get you the title shot? Because at the end of the day, what's a more impressive win? Do you give the more impressive win to Askar Askarov, who beat Alexandre Pantoja, an established flyweight who has proven to be very good in that division? Or do you give it to Kai Kara-France, who beat the champion coming down from another weight class? But that champion is on a little bit of a slide. It's an interesting question. And I'm not sure that I don't know the right answer. Because I think Kai Kara-France versus Brandon Moreno is a tremendous fight. But I'm not sure that Kai Kara-France is more deserving than Askar Askarov. But at the same time, I'm not sure that Askar Askarov is more deserving than Kai France. And I've just talked in circles here for about 5 minutes on who's more deserving, Kai France or Askar Askarov, and that is the best way to show you that who knows. It's very close. And if I had to pick right now, I bet they give it to Askar Askarov just because Dana didn't look to, Dana hasn't been the one to say that this is a title eliminator for Kai France. I think Kai France was in an unfortunate position where this was a title eliminator for Cody, but not for him. That's happened to other guys, and I think he has found himself in that unfortunate position. But I still think he's in a very good overall spot in this division. Moving on, Sean O'Malley versus Julian Paiva. This is another great performance by Sean O'Malley. Might be the best in his career, considering who he was fighting. Paiva, has recently came up from 125, and with that being said, he has a very good win against Kyler Phillips. So it's not like he hasn't done anything in the 135-pound division. He has a win over a highly respected guy in that division and was ranked 15th in that division. So Julian Paiva isn't a nobody. But Sean O'Malley, when he was able to connect, right, he landed a really big shot and was able to hurt Paiva. And the finishing instincts, the finishing instincts of Sean O'Malley are something that I love to see in someone who's unranked, right? Because there's going to be times down the road where, there's going to be times down the road where you can't do what you did against Hamas Almeida, right? There's going to be times where, for example, Kai France did that greatly as well, where he had Cody hurt, and there was no letting Cody stay in that fight, so it could be impressive, right? Sean O'Malley showed against Julian Paiva where, he's got the ability to, the second he hurts you, to put you out. And he did it in impressive fashion. The combos that he started letting rip against the cage when Paiva was backed up was tremendous. The hand speed, the variation in shot, right? It wasn't just hook, 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 hook. He was mixing in hooks, straights, body shots, uppercuts. A lot of variation in type of attack and where he was hitting. So, great finishing instincts. And Sean O'Malley proved again that he is as good as, the hype is telling you. The hype isn't there for no reason, right? The hype is there because he has the speed and the ability to do that. And one of the interesting things was that when the tide started to turn in this fight and he really started to take over, it was done a lot through the boxing. He landed some nice jabs. And when he hits a jab, when he was hitting Paiva with the jab, he was really connecting. Those were strong jabs, right? And coming from someone who, Sean O'Malley is obviously a good boxer. There's no debate about that. But Sean O'Malley has great kicks as well. And the tide really started to turn when the hands started to go. And he didn't attack at bad opportunities. He wasn't rushing things. He was taking things as they were given. And he was methodically landing, then eventually pop, the right hand lands, and it lands hard. And then he's able to put him away. So a tremendous performance for Sean O'Malley. And Sean O'Malley is in a tremendous spot because Sean O'Malley can fight anybody. Sean O'Malley, the only guy that he's fought ranked right now is Chito Vera. You can put him against any one of those rankings and you can justify it in a way, just about. I imagine he gets moved to 15 in the rankings. Maybe he doesn't. Cody Stamann's sitting at 15, and he's a good fighter. So I wouldn't be surprised if they leave Cody at 15. Just because. At the same time, Cody Garbrandt is probably going to get bumped from the 135-pound rankings. So everybody slides up one. So that gives you another open spot in the rankings, and Sean actually probably will fill that. Looking at the rankings, giving him someone like Cody Stamann makes sense, where Cody is he's a good enough all-around fighter, and Cody will try and challenge the wrestling. Sean Yadong makes sense, where Song Yadong is a really fun fighter to watch, and is very skilled. Frankie Edgar is another guy who will really test the wrestling. And I'm not saying that Sean O'Malley, when I say test the wrestling, I'm not saying that because Sean O'Malley is bad at wrestling. I'm saying that because there's a lot of people who doubt that skill being there. I personally believe that Sean O'Malley probably has a strong ground game based off what I've seen outside of the cage. But there's a lot of people who won't believe it until they see it in the UFC octagon, and that is a reasonable thing, you know. And I think Cody Stamann and Frankie Edgar will both make Sean O'Malley prove that he can wrestle, right? Looking at the rest of the 10 to 15 spots in those rankings, you've got Rafaela Santao at 12. Rafaela Santao is currently going up against Ricky Simone. I think that makes sense. However, Rafaela Santao is booked. Would have loved to see a Santao because he is an experienced veteran who has fought some of the top guys. I'd love to see how Sean shapes up against him. But he's got that fight with Ricky Simone. Maybe if he loses, even if he loses or wins, that's the thing about Sean O'Malley, is the UFC can say anything they want when it comes to Sean O'Malley. They can say, oh, we're going to push Sean O'Malley. Rafaela Santao won, he gets to fight Sean O'Malley. Or they can say, we're going to take him slow. Rafaela Santao's coming off a loss. If Rafaela Santao loses, he might be unranked. So they could give him another unranked guy, per se. So that really makes sense, even if Rafaela Santao loses, just because the UFC has so much flexibility in the narrative that they create surrounding a Sean O'Malley opponent. At 11, we have Marlon Chito Vera. I don't think that fight is going to happen right now. I think down the road that fight could happen, but I think the UFC is going to try and push Chito and Sean separately. I think you can push them separately and sell the rematch later down the road when they're both in the top 10 and both in the top 7, both in the top 5. And, if it doesn't work out for one of them, then the fight doesn't happen, obviously. But I don't think you need to run that back. It just, I don't really see the need for it. And then the last fight I will entertain for Sean O'Malley out of the ranked guys is Marlon Moraes. And Marlon Moraes would be a tremendous fight for Sean O'Malley. Marlon Moraes his last fight with Merab ended up being a war, an incredibly entertaining fight. And if you look at his other fights, Marlon Moraes is someone who has fought some of these top guys. That Marlon Moraes fight would be one that you're trying to push Sean, right? If you pick the Marlon Moraes fight. If you want to take it slow, Marlon Moraes isn't the fight. If you want to push him, I think Marlon Moraes is the fight. It's a good name on a resume. And even though Marlon Moraes hasn't won a lot as of late, it is still a name and a meaningful name in the sport. Marlon Moraes has a win over the current champion. And obviously styles make fights, but the name Marlon Moraes will always be meaningful in that bantamweight division for a while. Once you move up from there, you get to the Dominic Cruz, the Pedro Munhoz, the Cody Garbrandt, Merab. None of those are going to happen, so I'm not even going to talk about those. However, we will talk about Dom Cruz later. Now, but before we talk about Dom Cruz, we obviously have Josh Emmett versus Dan Ige. Josh Emmett, tremendous performance, had a torn ACL, comes back, gets a win against Dan Ige, right? They didn't throw Josh Emmett in there with a bum when he comes back. They throw him in there with Dan Ige. Dan Ige is a tremendous fighter, and Josh Emmett looked very good. He gets the knockdown in the first round. He gets a clear, unanimous decision victory. As good of a fight as that was, I don't think it was a 30-27. Someone scored it at 30-27. I think that's ridiculous. I think it's 29-28 Emmett very clearly. Whatever. It doesn't make a difference. Credit to Josh Emmett and his return. The question is, what is next for Josh Emmett? Josh Emmett was ranked number 7, tied with Giga Chikadze. Gets to win over number 9, Dan Ige. Where do we go? Me personally, you've got number 5, Kelvin Kattar, matched with number 7, Giga Chikadze. I think you go Josh Emmett against Arnold Allen. I think that makes sense, right? And then if you look at the top portion of that division above Kelvin Kattar. I think the winner of Giga Chikadze and Kelvin Kattar and Arnold Allen and Josh Emmett, if you make those fights, they both get someone ranked in the top 4. I think it makes sense, or you can pair them off against each other. I really like that fight. Arnold Allen versus Josh Emmett. Dan Ige, I think is going to slide a little bit because Dan Ige is someone who everyone knows is talented, and he's only lost to really talented fighters. Dan Ige, with his most recent loss, obviously coming to Josh Emmett. Before that, he lost to the Korean Zombie. What else does he have on here? Losses to Emmett, Korean Zombie, Kelvin Kattar, with wins over Gavin Tucker and Edson Barbosa, right? So Dan Ige is obviously a great fighter. But based off who he's already fought and the fact that he's lost 2 in a row, I think he slides a little bit, which isn't necessarily terrible. But I think he is looking at a prospect, right? I don't think they do Bryce Mitchell. They booked Bryce Mitchell and Edson Barbosa, so they don't do Bryce Mitchell at all. I think 12 Sadiq Yusuff makes sense. Sadiq Yusuff is a very talented guy, one of the top prospects in that division. Loses to Arnold Allen, no shame in that. But I think Dan Ige and Sadiq Yusuff is a good fight to make. Moving on, Dominick Cruz and Pedro Munhoz. Pedro Munhoz got off to a hot start here, He got 2 drops early, was touching up Dominick Cruz, had some success early. Dominick Cruz comes back rounds 2 and 3, and this is the most power we've seen Dom Cruz hit with in a while. There was an exchange there where he landed, I think it was a big knee, and was really following up with some really good hooks. I thought he was possibly looking at a finish. He doesn't get the finish, but he clearly wins rounds 2 and 3, walks away with a win. Once you let Dominick Cruz start flowing, you're in a bad spot. And he started flowing, and Pedro Munhoz faced the consequences. So Cruz looked really, really, really good, and I'm really impressed. Cruz, however, might be the hardest person to matchmake because it's interesting how he gets booked with the champion Henry Cejudo, and then he has to fight an unranked guy after he loses to Cejudo, and then he beats Casey Kenny, and he gets a fight against the 8th ranked guy, right? And he beats him very clearly, right? And now you've got the 7th ranked guy now in Cody Garbrandt, who's no longer going to be ranked. And you have Merab. I don't think Cruz versus Merab makes sense necessarily. Do you do a Rob Font? Do you do a Corey Sandhagen? Do you do a Jose Aldo? Is Dom Cruz still currently at that level? There's only one way to find out, but at the same time, there's only so many matches there, right? Do you do TJ versus Jose? If you do TJ versus Jose, that leaves you Sandhagen and Font. Dominick Cruz didn't get matched up in that sequence. So I'm interested to see where they go. I'm not going to be mad if they book him against an Aldo, against a Sandhagen, against a Font. Maybe I would be a little frustrated with Aldo because I think Aldo is really close to a title shot, and I think Aldo needs to fight TJ or Sandhagen. It's interesting and it's tough. It's really tough for Dominick Cruz. I'm really interested, and actually, I just realized we didn't talk about where Cody was going to go from here. But the match they make for Cody is interesting. Maybe Cody versus Dom Cruz for the rematch. Maybe you do. Maybe Cody makes sense for Sean. I don't imagine Cody stays at 125. I think if you lose, I think it's easier to get out of bed at the end of the day and train for someone like Cody Garbrandt or Pedro Munhoz or Marlon Moraes. Marlon Moraes versus Cody Garbrandt actually makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't mind seeing that fight at all. But I think it makes a lot more sense, and I think it's easier to motivate yourself to work up those 135-pound rankings and fight some of those guys, right? Rather than when you're at 125 pounds and you just lost, and he lost to the number 6 guy. You can fight Rodrigo Bojarin, Matthias Nicolau, Matt Schnell, David Dvorak. It's like, do you want to fight those guys, or do you want to fight the Dom Cruzes, the Pedro Munhozes, the Marlon Moraes, the Chito Veras, the Frankie Edgars? I just think it's easier at the end of the day to get up out of bed and train for someone who you've seen in the sport for a while. And I might be wrong on that. I might be off on that, but I just think the name value there gives Cody a little bit more to go after. And I don't think the experiment at 125 pounds worked, and that's fine. I called it an experiment for a reason, and it didn't work out for Cody, and that happens. But I think we move back to 135 pounds. Maybe he stays in the rankings. Maybe he doesn't. I'll be interested to see where the rankings have him on Tuesday. But I think Cody's going to take some time off, probably. I think a lot of guys take times off. It's the holidays. A lot of guys are going to probably stop training for about a month. We're going to have to kickstart things again after the new year, probably. So a lot of these matches that I've talked about so far aren't going to happen right away. But, there's going to be an interesting wave of matchmaking here at 135 pounds when you're looking at the Cody Garbrandts, the Dominic Cruzes, the Pedro Munhozes, the top guys who aren't matched: Dillashaw, Aldo, Santang, Font, Marab, Marlon, a Santao, Edgar, Sean O'Malley. All these guys are unbooked, and we're going to start getting some matchups. It might not be for a month, it might not be for 2 months, but these guys are going to start getting paired up with one another, and I think we're going to have another series of exciting fights to look forward to at 135 pounds, both at the top of that division and closer to the bottom 15. Moving on, the last fight we are going to talk about today. That's going to be Tai Tuivasa and Augusto Sakai. Tai came in, and the thing that I said about Tai Tuivasa in the preview episode was, hey, Tai Tuivasa is very good at landing the big shot. A lot of guys can't land that big shot. A lot of guys at heavyweight have the power to knock you out, but lack the ability to land the shot that does it. Tai Tuivasa is not that guy. Tai Tuivasa will land, and that shot will put your lights out. And that happened against Augusto Sakai. He gets him hurt initially, and that shot he landed that put Tai Tuivasa, or put Augusto Sakai out, was tremendous. And Augusto Sakai isn't a nobody, right? Tai Tuivasa did that against an established heavyweight. And I think the improvements Tai Tuivasa has made have been tremendous. Let me pull up what he's done in the UFC. But he's kind of turned his career around. He's sneaky at 14-3. He's on a 4-fight win streak, yeah. And he was on a win streak, and he beat some guys in the UFC. He's got a lot of UFC fights. He started his UFC career off 3-0. The third one coming against Andrei Arlovsky, and then he really got thrown into the wolves, and he fought Eugenio Dos Santos, didn't win that fight. He fought Blagnov Ivanov, did not win that fight. Fought Sergey Spivak, and he didn't win that fight. But after that, he has came back, and he has beat Stefan Struve, and he has beat Harry Hunsucker, and he has beat Greg Hardy. Those three guys, Stefan Struve and Greg Hardy are established names, but a lot of people don't think they're the best guy out there, right? Even though they both have really good records, Harry Hunsucker isn't really like your established guy at 285 pounds, or 265 pounds, excuse me. But Augusto Sakai, him doing what he's been doing and doing it to Augusto Sakai, is probably the best win of his career. The win against Andrei Arlovsky is obviously a great win, That was a decision, however. I think going out there and putting the lights out of Augusto Sakai the way he did it is very, 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 very impressive. And I think Tai Tuivasa is seeing ranked names from here once again, obviously. He beat the number 1 rank or 11 ranked guy. Ooh. He beat the 11th ranked guy. And he is going to get another ranked guy. The question is who? Who are we going? The one fight that I don't want to see is Tom Aspinall. Let Tom Aspinall, Chris Douskis, and Tai Tuivasa all work up the heavyweight rankings separately, right? That way, when they get to the top 7, when they get to the top 5, Dauskas is already there. He's in the top 7, and if he beats Derrick Lewis, he's close to a title shot. But let those guys beat some established guys, right? Don't burn those matchups with your bright prospects. Don't burn the Tom Aspinall and Tai Tuivasa fight right now. Because if you burn that right now, in a year and a half, you're going to be looking at the heavyweight division going, well, everybody's already fought each other. That's what we've been dealing with half these guys already. So don't burn those matchups until you're way closer to a title, right? So, he'll probably be ranked 12th, I imagine. I don't think he jumps Ivanov just because Ivanov beat him. So I think he's in 11-12. Doesn't make that big of a difference. But I think Marcin Tybura makes sense. And yeah, I like the Marcin Tybura fight. On the other hand, for Augusto Sakai, I don't think he should slide too far because he's got some good UFC fights. I think he should stay fighting ranked guys. There aren't a lot of unranked heavyweights that I am currently, itching to see fight ranked opponents. I honestly can't think of one off the top of my head of unranked heavyweights that I want to see. And that just goes to show that the UFC needs to put some more resources in the heavyweight division. That's a conversation for another day. The unranked guys at heavyweight, you have Alexander Romanov. He's got a bout scheduled, I believe. Why are there so many PFL and Bellator guys on here? Alexei Oleinik and Greg Hardy are already booked. Andrei Arlovsky, he's working back towards the rankings. That's interesting. Marcos Lima, Ben Rothwell, Alir Latifi. Right, there isn't a lot of unranked guys that are. Alex Gustafsson. Right, there aren't a lot of unranked guys who are really working their way. Tanner Bozer, maybe, coming off a win over Ovince St. Preux. Juan Espinoza just lost. That's a tough one in terms of prospects. There just aren't a lot of prospects running around in that division where, there just aren't, like I said, there just aren't a lot of guys outside that top 15 right now that you really just need to see fight a ranked guy. So I think Augusto Sakai stays fighting ranked opponents. I think it comes in the form of Walt Harris. And that is the last fight we're going to talk about. I usually like to... Well, actually, we're going to talk about the main event of next week. I was going to skip the card. We're gonna make this brief. We've been going for a while. My throat kind of hurts because last night was a tremendous UFC pay-per-view. And if your throat isn't sore after watching a UFC pay-per-view, I don't know if you had enough excitement watching it. But we've got Derrick Lewis and Chris Douskis. These two are going to come out boxing. Derrick Lewis is actually become increasingly multidimensional as he's gotten older. I lean Derrick Lewis. I think the experience is going to help, but I think Chris Douskis could go out and catch an upset. And then let's make these rapid. We're gonna let some predictions rip. Wonder Boy versus Bilal Muhammad. I think Wonder Boy is going to be able to stay on the outside and pick Bilal Muhammad apart. I think that's going to be similar to the Jeff Neal fight. So I'm going Wonder Boy. the Amanda Lemos versus Angela Hill. I'm going Amanda Lemos. I think she has ridiculous power. Every time I watch the power in her hands at the division, every single time I'm surprised. So I'm going to pick her. I love Angela Hill, but every time I watch Lemos fight, I am thoroughly impressed. So I'm going Lemos. Rafaela Santao versus Ricky Simone. Rafaela, I'm going Ricky Simone here. I just think that I've been impressed with some of his most recent performances. Ricky Simone is someone who at one point a lot of people thought was a UFC champion. A lot of people thought he had that caliber of talent. And then he got a win over Marab. I'm just looking at his resume. Got a win over Montel Jackson, Ronnie Yanha, Ray Borg, Brian Kelleher. And, he dropped some fights to Uriah Faber and Rob Font. No shame in that. But I think if Ricky Simone comes out and puts on his best performance, I think Ricky Simone walks away with a victory. And then we have Diego Fajeda versus Matez Gamrat. Gamrat being one of the best prospects at 155 pounds. And he is a part of an invasion of those rankings. Right? If you look at the top 15 rankings at the lightweight division, you've got Greg Gillespie, Rafael Fiziev, Diego Fajeda, who's been around a little bit, Armin Sarukian, Brad Riddell, Joel Alvarez, a lot of really talented guys who are knocking on the door. And I think that Matez Gamrat is going to add his name to that collection of ranked fighters. I think he beats Diego Fajeda. I really think he's a tremendous fighter. We've got Cub Swanson versus Darren Elkins. This is going to be a throwback war. I lean Cub Swanson. I'm leaning Cub Swanson. Skipping around a little bit. We're not going to talk about every single one. Ronnie Barcelos versus Victor Henry. Give me Ronnie Barcelos. He's a tremendous fighter, one of the top prospects at bantamweight. He recently suffered a loss, which pushed him back a little bit to Timur Valiev. But I think he gets back on track here against Victor Henry. There's a reason he was one of the top prospects, but Victor Henry does have a very impressive resume fighting outside of the UFC, coming over. He's got some rising fights, so he has fought some really good competition, but I'm leaning towards Ronnie Barcelos. Who else do we want to talk about here? Sarah Eubanks and Melissa Gatto. Give me Melissa Gatto. Does it have anything to do with the fighting? No, but Eubanks is one of the least likable fighters in the UFC. She's not a great person. If you don't know anything about Sarah Eubanks, go look into her, and I promise you will be rooting for Melissa Gatto in this fight. She is not a good person, so we're rooting for Melissa Gatto. Charles Jourdain versus Andre Ewell might be a fun fight. Give me Charles Jourdain. Raquel Pennington versus Macy Chiasson. Pioneer in Raquel Pennington. A little bit younger fighter in Macy Chiasson. Not younger, but 7-1, working her way up. She's 30, so it's not like she's a youngin' coming out of nowhere. So that should be an interesting fight in its own right. And that's the last fight we're going to talk about. So, but, that's a really fun fight night card with 5 fights that from Louis Dauskas, Wonderboy Muhammad, Lemos Hill, Santao Samoan, Fajeda Gamrat, Swanson Elkins, Barcelos Henry. Those are all really important fights. Whether it be prospects, whether it be veterans, whether it be vying for spots and rankings, a lot of really important fights there. So I'm really excited. That's a good fight night to end the year off on. This was a really good pay-per-view. The UFC has been on a tremendous streak with their pay-per-views, and they added another one with UFC 269. And like always, I will be back next week to talk about UFC Fight Night Lewis versus Douskis, and I'm excited to do that because, like I said, there are a lot of fun fights on that card. And before we get out of here, I would like to thank you for watching this episode of the Head Kick KO podcast. Make sure you tune in next week because we're going to be in the same place doing the same thing. Thank you. Goodbye.